Now with the Toronto housing market finally normalizing, are you thinking about getting into the marketplace and becoming an investor? Are you thinking about actually becoming a landlord? Well, in this video, I'm gonna go through the top 6 things that I think you should consider if you're thinking about becoming an investor and a landlord here in Ontario. And make sure you stay until the end because number 6 is one that people often don't think about. So let's get to it. Hi everybody, my name is Connie Sarvanandan and I am an active real estate agent and investor and landlord here in Toronto and the GTA. And in this video, I'm going to give you 6 things that I think you should consider if you are thinking about becoming an investor and landlord in Ontario. So the first thing is really financing. So what do I mean by financing? Well, first of all, the thing you need to consider when you're doing an investment property is that it does not qualify for mortgage insurance, which means you typically need 20% or more as your down payment for an investment property. And my recommendation is always talk to a lender to understand your overall financial picture and to understand exactly what you can afford. Remember, talking to a lender costs you nothing, and it'll give you a really good indication of what you can and cannot afford, especially if this is your first investment property. So with that 20% or more that you have to come up with, currently you can get it from a line of credit or your home equity line of credit. So for example, if you own a home and you have some equity in there and you have a home equity line of credit, you can use that as part of your down payment. Now, there is rumors that this is going to be going away. So depending on when you decide to do this, make sure you ask your lender about that, especially if that is your plan to borrow from a line of credit in order to make up for your down payment. So that's the first thing. The second thing you need to consider is really what is your objective when it comes to buying an investment property and a rental property. So what do I mean by objective? Really, there's 2 objectives. The first objective is cash flow and the second objective would be appreciation. And sometimes you can get both, but sometimes you have to pick one or the other. So cash flow means that every month you want to have some extra cash from your rental. So let's say, you collect your rent, you pay all your expenses, and at the end of the day, you're still making money. So that is cash flow, which is great, but that money will get added to your income and you'll be taxed as part of, that will be taxed as part of your income. So for some people, that's what they're trying to achieve. And there's things like the capex rate and other things that can help you determine, whether or not a property makes sense if cash flow is your objective. Now, the second thing is really appreciation. And for us in Toronto, when we've bought rental properties, we're really looking at appreciation. So we believe the appreciation of the asset is where the value is. So we're not really trying to make money on a monthly basis. We were just trying to break even. And sometimes we've even taken a loss because we believe that the appreciation on properties in Toronto has been so significant and it's always worked out for us. But either which way, you really have to understand it because depending on what your objective is, that's really going to determine how you are managing it on a daily basis, which leads to the third point, which is expenses. So when you buy a property, it's really important that you understand all the expenses of a property, whether you're gonna buy it to live in it or you're gonna buy it to rent it, because you need to account for all of that and then make sure you're covered off either with you providing funding for it or you're covering it off in the rent that you want to charge. And sometimes what you'll find out is, when you take everything together, it doesn't actually make sense to buy a certain property because it's not going to cover off all of the expenses in a way that makes sense for you. So some of the things that you have to look at when it comes to expenses is obviously your financing costs, so your mortgage and your interest. Then other things like taxes, utilities. Even if you're passing the utilities on to your tenant, you need to make sure that all of the utilities can be passed on to the tenant. There might be things that can't be, or there might be things that a tenant won't take on. Other things like snow shoveling or yard cleanup if it's a detached property. Those are all things that you have to consider. If the property has something like a pool or a hot tub, who's going to manage that maintenance? All of these things are really important to think about. In addition to that, you should always have a reserve fund available for any outstanding issues that might come up. So for example, the dryer breaks down, you got to buy a new dryer. You should have put some money aside to account for those kinds of things as well. So understanding your overall expenses is really critical. And you know, if you're doing a condo, it's a little bit easier because the maintenance fees is there. You'll understand exactly what's included in the maintenance fees and what's not. But if it's a detached home, you really need to make sure you understand any outside pieces that may not be evident. Like things like snow removal, gardening, things like that. So that's number 3. Number 4, if you're finding this content helpful, please like and subscribe. It really helps us out. And if you have any real estate needs here in Toronto or the GTA, feel free to call, text, email, or WhatsApp, and we'll be sure to take care of you. And if you want to talk to me directly, I'm going to put my calendar link down below. Number 4 is, what kind of landlord do you want to be? Do you want to be an active landlord or a passive landlord? So what does that mean? An active landlord is you taking care of everything. A passive landlord is you hiring somebody else to do it. So as an active landlord, you know, you're the one who's going to be on call. You're the one who's, for anything that comes up, from a leaky faucet to a, you know, something gone wrong within the property at all, that you're going to be the one that's responsible for all of that. You're also the one who's going to be vetting the clients as far as you know, applications go. You're the one that's collecting the rent, all of those things. That's an active landlord. A passive landlord is somebody who hires a property management company to take care of that for you. And property management could cost you between 5 and 20% depending on what they are doing for you. But obviously the more they do for you, typically that's the more it costs you. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that when it comes to paying for property management, that is one of the write-offs that you get as part of an investment property, but it also is going to cut into your bottom line on what you will and will not take home. So definitely something to consider, and definitely if you are going to pay a property management company, that's another expense that you have to account for, which will affect your overall expenses. And then again, that's going to affect whether or not you're going to have cash flow or not. So everything kind of ties in together, but it's just really important that you look at all the moving pieces. And by the way, none of this is rocket science. It's really easy stuff. It's just remembering all the pieces. And so make sure when you are looking at investments, you look at all of the pieces. The 5th thing on our list. So number 5 is probably the most obvious, which is the actual property itself. But what's key here is that you really understand a good property for rental. Because a good property overall isn't necessarily a good property for rental. Because if you buy something that people don't want to actually rent, then you're not going to make much money. And remember, in all of real estate, the real money is in the buy. If you buy something that is great and at the right price, you will always do well in real estate. Now, when you are looking at rental history and what you can look at rentals and what they're getting for a certain unit that you're looking at, make sure you do an apples to apples comparison. So what do I mean by that? I mean, like, for example, if you're looking at a condo building and you see that a similar size unit rented for this amount, that's great. But make sure you understand what's included in the rent. Is hydro included or not included in the rent? Make sure you understand the condition of the units. Is the unit you're looking at as renovated as the one that rented, or is it better or worse? Those are things to consider. And by the way, if you're working with a real estate agent that understands the rental market, this is all very easy and should be straightforward. So understanding exactly the type of rent you could get for the area you're looking at and what is important to renters in that area is going to be critical. A perfect example is something like parking. Now, I generally will not look at a property unless it includes some parking, because for me personally, I need a parking spot no matter what. But you could find a rental that doesn't have parking that rents out really well. And if you're never gonna live in that unit, maybe that is something you would consider. And maybe it's in a part of Toronto that doesn't need parking because there's gazillion ways to get around and it's above a subway station. There's lots of those, and that might be fine. Or you're in a place where parking is critical and a big part of the rent. So make sure you understand what's important to the renters in that specific area and for the specific unit that you are looking at buying. And then the sixth and final one that I think is really important and one that people often miss is understanding the Landlord and Tenant Act. The Landlord and Tenant Act is critical to understand because if you're going to be a landlord, this is what you have to follow. And some people don't understand that you don't have like easy control over certain things that you think would be obvious. So for example, rent control. You cannot raise the rent to whatever you want, even at the end of a lease. So for example, if you have a rental and you're renting it out for $1,000 a month and you have a 1-year lease, at the end of the 1-year lease, that lease automatically rolls over to month. And if you want to increase the rent for those tenants, you would have to give them 3 months notice that you were increasing the rent, and then you would only be allowed to increase the rent by the amount that the government tells you you're allowed to, and the amount changes every year. But for 2022, it was 1.2%. So on $1,000, that would be $12 that you could increase the rent. Now, what if like your next door neighbor just bought their property and they're charging $2,000 for that exact same unit, and you want to raise the rent to match next door? You can't do that. If you have an existing tenant, then you're allowed to raise the rent by the legal guidelines. So those are just some of the things that are within the Landlord and Tenant Act that you need to understand so that you don't think you can go in and just buy a property and do whatever you want to do. The other big thing about understanding it is it's going to make your relationship with your tenants much easier and clearer. I will say we've been landlords for over 20 years and we've always gotten along with our tenants. And I think that's critical because of two things. One is we're good landlords and we have good tenants, so it's been mutually beneficial. And two is we've done a really good job about vetting our tenants before they become our tenants. So we've made sure we've done a lot of due diligence to ensure that we're getting great tenants, and it's always worked out for us. So understanding landlord and tenant is the last thing that I think you should make sure that you understand. So that's it. I hope you found this helpful. If you have any questions or comments, please make them below. We love hearing from you, good or bad, because that helps us decide what kind of content is important to you. And if you have any real estate needs, feel free to call, text, email, or WhatsApp. We love helping clients from around the world, and we do it all the time. And if you want to talk to me directly, my calendar link is below. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.